Welcome to A Dose of Feeling. I'm Mushka, just a real human navigating the beautiful chaos of life. This podcast is about keeping it real, sharing my highs, lows, and the lessons that shaped me. It's a mix of stories, inspiration, and honest conversations, like chatting with a friend who just gets it. So get comfy and let's dive into this journey together. Let's feel it all.
Hello, feelers, and welcome back to another episode. I'm so glad you're here again. And today's episode is going to be about boundaries and 3 lessons that I have learned in boundaries. Boundaries are one of those things that it could either be easy to do and makes things harder, or it can be harder to do and make things easier. I'm going to explain a little. Basically, when there are times where I feel confident that a boundary is important to implement, and it's relatively natural for me to follow through with this boundary, but then the situation is generally really hard. And then on the other hand, when it feels really hard to put in a boundary, it ends up being that it makes the situation so much easier. So it's one of those things that I just learned a lot along the way. There have been some really painful times in my life when I needed to implement boundaries, or creating boundaries caused a lot of pain. And I don't always believe that I know what I'm doing, and sometimes I will make a mistake and I'll say, is that the best thing? Is that the right thing? But in the moment, if I feel it, if I need it, then that's where I follow through. So the biggest lesson that I learned in boundaries is that boundaries are an act of self-love. And it's not a rejection. It's not, I have something against you personally. People think that often you put in a boundary and you're pushing someone away. And it's not really about that. For me, it's protecting my energy and a lot of the time my mental health, my values, and it comes from a place of self-love and self-worth rather than guilt. I really struggled with this for a long time because if you've heard previous episodes, you know I was the person who really people-pleased, and I had a hard time choosing myself, and I just said yes when I meant no, or I wanted everyone else to be happy, so I didn't want to disappoint anyone or be seen as selfish. But one day it must have been things in my relationship dynamics, family dynamics, which really stood out the most for me, because I was so tired and I was so drained, and I started to resent people, and I wanted to please you. So why am I resenting you? Why am I resenting this situation? So that's when I realized, boundaries can be about helping myself, not necessarily pushing you away. And it's not a rejection to you, but an invitation for myself. And sometimes they say boundaries aren't selfish. Putting in boundaries doesn't mean that you're selfish. And maybe this is hard to say here, is that I do believe it's okay to be selfish. And that is something that I've learned as I really step into more of me and my confidence in owning myself and what I do, is that I'm allowed to be selfish sometimes. There's nothing wrong with looking at the outside of your life and say, okay, all these things don't really work for me. I'm going to make it work for me. And there are ways to be selfish in healthy ways. So as long as you're taking it from a place of self-respect and self-love, and not anger or blame, revenge, then it really changes that narrative. And a lot of the time that I put in boundaries that may directly affect my relationships, I do get pushback. People question, and in the past there were some incidences where I had very painful times with some relationships, and it changed a lot for me, and people didn't understand. And even now, as time has passed, I feel like people do slowly start to understand. But people understand, people really value boundaries. And if people value you, there is an understanding. So if you feel like you are in the process of implementing a boundary, or you're afraid to implement a boundary, just know that it's okay for you to possibly get pushback, and it feels hard, but then that leads into kind of this next thing. It really exposes who respects you. And there were people who really had gotten used to me always being available, saying yes, doing what they wanted. And I got a lot of manipulation and pushback. Oh, you've changed. Oh, why are you doing this? For a long time, I doubted myself. Maybe I should just give up and go back to how things were. But I realized something powerful, again, that if people love you and respect you, it will be okay. And I find that that's a really big gift of boundaries for me. They've shown me who is in my life because they value me, and who's in my life because they can take advantage of me. And if you don't want to lose people, don't think about that. You're not losing anyone. You're gaining way more because you're deserving, because you're seeing who deserves to be in your life. And I had to learn this the hard way. And the relationships that I have now have really become so much healthier and honest and more fulfilling. And I have strengthened a lot of my values in a relationship because of that. I would say particularly implementing boundaries in a marriage, in a partnership. You want to be seen as being able to respect yourself. So if you find that something isn't tolerable in your relationship, something isn't acceptable, you're showing your partner that you are, not only is this knowing for yourself, but for your partner to see that you're showing your partner that you know the true value of yourself. And that's really important for them to see, that you take care of yourself. And maybe that can help them, or maybe that can just at least help them in how they treat you. You can't express or receive love until you've done so for yourself. Now, I would say that when I share a bit about this, I'm talking mainly about relationships that I've had, my marriage, family, friendships. And this big lesson that I have learned the hard way is, okay, setting boundaries is one thing, but the real work is in enforcing them. And I would put in boundaries, especially in my marriage. And if you've heard parts of my living with my husband who had an addiction at some point, and you have to put in boundaries when it comes to addiction, because there are certain things that you just can't tolerate, safety-wise, relationship-wise. And so I would say, I cannot have you in the house if you do XYZ. I can't talk to you if you do XYZ. But then I would be like, okay, I don't want my husband to not talk to me today. Or we have to go out, or we have something on. And I'd be like, oh shoot, but I'm implementing this boundary right now. And that's it. Before I knew it, my boundaries weren't anything. They were just suggestions, and my husband wasn't taking me seriously. And the truth in all of this is that if you don't respect your own boundaries, no one around you will either. So I had to get honest with myself, and I would say if I'm doing this boundary, I have to mean it. And it meant that when I'm putting in this boundary, I have to think about what the chances are of it having to be used. And this is making me think of a similarity between even parenting. I tell my kids, we need to clean up the toys before we go to the playground. And they don't clean up the toys, but in my mind, we're going to the playground. And that's the thing. You're showing them that your word doesn't matter. And it's similar in boundaries. Your word has to mean something. And if I said no, it was a firm no. If I needed space, it meant I needed space. If we had somewhere to be, I had to figure out, well, don't make a boundary like that if you're going to need to be around your husband. There are so many minor, quote unquote, minor boundaries that I give for myself. I won't look at my phone in the morning, and I'll sometimes say to myself, oh yeah, but let me just respond to this one text. And I'd make an exception. Make one here, make one there. And before I know it, that's it. My boundaries are gone. And so do I want to be honest with myself? Do I want to take care of myself? If so, if I care that deeply, then when I did make this boundary, it obviously felt right in that moment. And yes, of course, I can adjust it. But in those moments, I know that that's what I needed. And so following through is showing myself that I can stay consistent and committed to what I need. Any level of setting boundaries is really uncomfortable because you have to do something that is going to make people uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for you, it's uncomfortable for other people. And I always felt like a need to justify myself so that nobody was upset. And again, that's going back to this people-pleasing behavior. But I know that people don't need an explanation. They just need to know that I'm standing by them and that I'm standing firm in them. It shows consistency, it shows commitment to yourself and to them, that you keep your word and that you value yourself. You value your interactions and your relationships. And I must say that almost every single boundary that I have followed through with, I would say almost because I'm sure there's a couple, but I can't think of them now, I am deeply proud of and I do not regret. And listen, if you struggle with following through, maybe just ask yourself, am I setting the right boundaries? If I'm not enforcing them, maybe they're not the boundaries that I am willing to enforce. Are you worried about upsetting people or conflict? It'll happen, but it's the boundary has to outweigh for you what else you're going to get without that boundary. I often find myself thinking back to the times where the boundaries are hard, but in those moments I felt really empowered because I knew that I wasn't implementing any boundaries from a place of anger or revenge. It was really because I knew what my emotional, mental, even physical capabilities were, and it wasn't worth it for me to lose that level of peace. I remember being in some of those hard emotional places, particularly with my mental health. I sacrificed so much because I wanted to be liked or accepted. And yeah, it really made things worse when I didn't have boundaries in that time. Sometimes you just have to say no to someone or whatever it is, and that's it. Don't explain yourself. It's okay just to say no or I can't, and to know why, but not necessarily having to tell other people why. That is that is just what you need. I do want to just add here that for someone who is experiencing addiction or supporting a loved one in addiction, boundaries are really hard. It's a fine line between what some would say being supportive and enabling, between like holding space and losing yourself in the chaos. It's about what you allow. I know the guilt, I know this fear and this discomfort because I know, I've been there. I also know the peace and the freedom and the self-respect that comes when you really start to choose yourself and take care of yourself. You're worthy of the boundaries you set, and you're worthy of the values that you try to keep to. Yeah, so that was just a few takeaways that I had noted down, and I find that I mean, there are so many lessons and boundaries. When I discovered what boundaries were, it was probably only like, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. And I was like, wait, all along there was something I could do to protect myself. We're going to figure this out and we're going to implement them all. So I hope that this episode gave you something to think about. And if it did resonate, I'd love to hear from you and keep whatever conversation going. Just keep choosing yourself. Really, this deep feeling and healing part of us wants to be seen and chosen. And this is one of the best ways how. So again, thank you for being here. Have a lovely day and we will talk soon. Bye bye.